The ring was supposed to deliver Princess Araya Seneval into a hall of 10,000 candles, and instead it threw her out sideways, 11 feet above a human loading deck, in a gown that weighed more than she did. The train of veil silk caught on a cargo hook swinging past on its gantry line, jerked her up short like a snagged kite, and left her hanging over a lane of moving freight while alarms she did not understand barked in a language she had learned only enough of to say, "Thank you, and where is my escort?" Below her, a young man with a tally counter in one fist looked up, said 38 to no one she could see, drew a knife from his belt and kept counting. 39, he said, as a container the size of a banquet hall slid past on its rails beneath her. Slippers. He stepped onto a stack of load braces without watching his feet, the way her dance master used to climb the rehearsal scaffold. 40. "I am," she began, in high Arital then in trade tongue. "I am of the Arital court, and this is—" "Hold still." He reached up, gathered the snagged train in his free hand, and cut it with one pull close to the hook, the knife already back in its sheath, before her weight came down into the crook of his arm, and the deck rose to meet her feet. He set her upright the way he might set a crate that had shifted in transit, squarely, without ceremony, checking that she stayed put. 41, he said, eyes already past her shoulder, on the next container in the lane. 42, a length of her train, woven by 9 blind sisters of the veil over 3 years, hung from the cargo hook and rode away down the gantry line toward a sorting bay, like a pennant of surrender. "You cut my gown," she said. "Gown was about to cut you," he said. "Hook lane's rated for 60 tons and doesn't slow down for silk." 43. He glanced at her then, one full second of attention, gray eyes in a face, too young for the scar along the jaw. "Medical's aft of the yellow line." "You bleeding?" "I am a princess of the Orbital court." "Congratulations. You bleeding?" "No." "Then you're standing in my count lane." He took her elbow, firmly, briefly, the way no being had touched her since her investiture, moved her 3 steps left, behind a painted yellow boundary, and let go. "Stay behind the line," he said, and walked back into the moving iron, calling 44, into the noise, and that was all. That was the whole of her reception into the human world, a knife, a count, and a yellow line. She stood where he had put her, in the wreckage of a procession gown, on a deck that smelled of hot metal and machine grease and burnt sugar from somewhere. Coffee, she would learn. Everything on this dock would eventually smell of coffee, and she looked up at the thing she had fallen out of. The weft ring rose through the heart of the station like the wedding band of a god, half a mile of braided alloy and ring-right crystal. And it was dark, not dim dark. The lattice at its center, which should have shimmered like water deciding to be light, hung in dead gray threads. 2 figures in the umber robes of the Calibrant Guild were already standing on the maintenance ring with hand lamps. And even from the deck, even in shock, court training read their posture for her the way it had been trained to read everything. The stillness of officials in the presence of a disaster too large for blame. The procession had gone through. 600 courtiers, her wardrobe, her dowry, her chaperone, the master of processions with his ivory staff, her name in the marriage registry of the Solon's throne. All of it had crossed the lattice ahead of her. The ring had failed in the half-second between her chaperone's heel and her own slipper. It had cut her out of her own life the way the young man's knife had cut her out of her own gown. One clean pull, no ceremony. A station official reached her 4 minutes later, breathless, a human woman with iron gray hair and a coat with more pockets than rank markings. By then Araya had counted the exits, the cranes, the crew, and the cameras, because a princess is taught from the age of 4 to enter any room and know who in it can hurt her, who in it will lie to her, and where the doors are. It was the only skill she owned that seemed to have survived the fall. "Station Master Imkatan," the woman said. "Pelham Reach, Freight Dock 9, you're the spillover from the ring. I am Araya Seneval, 3rd daughter of the Veiled Sovereign, princess of the Iridel court, betrothed of Prince Idamar of the Solon's throne." It came out level. Her voice had been trained by tutors who threw handfuls of gravel at her composure for 6 hours a day. "I require a secure channel to my mother's court, quarters appropriate to my station, and the immediate restoration of the ring." Tan looked at her for a moment with an expression Araya could not at first place, because no one had ever aimed it at her before. It was not awe, and it was not hostility. It was arithmetic. She was being weighed the way the containers were weighed to see what handling she required. "Channel I can do, but you won't like the math on it," Tan said. "We're 19 light days from the Iridal relay. Message gets there in 19 days. Answer comes back in 19 more. Quarters will find you a bunk tonight. And the ring." Tan turned and looked up at the dead lattice, and the arithmetic in her face turned grim. "Ring's not mine. Ring belongs to the Calibrants, and the Calibrants answer to nobody, including your mother, including my charter, including God. But I'll tell you what their elder told me 10 minutes ago, free of charge. The anchor coil sheared its harmonic. They have to regrow the crystal. It can't be rushed, it can't be bought, and it takes a season. A season, Araya repeated. 97 days local. The next convoy that could carry you toward Iridel space leaves in about the same window, so the ring's your fastest road no matter how you cut it. Tan's eyes went over the gown, the slippers, the small ransom of jewels sewn into the bodice, with the same flat math. 97 days. Your Highness, the question that matters tonight is a smaller one. Which is? Where you'll be standing while you wait. The smaller question turned out to be the entire shape of the world. Pelham Reach was a working dock. Tan said those two words the way priests said consecrated, strung on a spur of gantries at the edge of the gas giant's amber glare, where the weft ring met the slow rivers of human freight. The arrangement, Tan explained as she walked her through corridors of riveted plate, was the oldest treaty either species had. The great courts of the weft moved souls and silk and treaties through their rings, and considered the moving of bulk mass beneath them, gross tonnage, raw alloy, grain, fuel, the actual blood of civilization. Humans moved it for them. Humans had been moving it for 200 years, in convoys that crawled between stars while the courts stepped across them like stones in a garden, and every ring in the weft had a human dock at its foot the way every palace had a kitchen. And the law of the dock, Tan said, stopping at a hatch marked berthing, is the same law every human dock has run on since the first one. Work for berth. Everyone aboard is crew or cargo. Crew works. Cargo pays freight. There's no third category. There's no third category, Tan said, not unkindly, the way you repeat a thing to someone newly bereaved. Your bodice there is sewn with stones that would buy this whole spur, and I can't take one of them, because the second I take a royal jewel off a stranded royal, every court in the weft calls it ransom and my charter's ash. I can't bill your mother. The message alone takes 38 days to round trip, and the Carriers Guild audits my books in 90. I can't carry you free for a season because the book shows every meal and every liter of air, and the day my book shows charity births is the day the Hallmark Combine, who would dearly love this dock's charter, reads it out loud to the guild. You see the shape of it? Araya stood in the hatchway of the berthing deck and saw the shape of it. The bunks ran in stacked rows like the drawers of an apothecary cabinet, each one a steel coffin with a curtain, a lamp, and a vent. Somewhere down the row a welder was snoring. The whole deck smelled of soap and metal and other people's sleep. In the Iridal court, she had a wing. The wing had a name. The name had a song. What work, she said, and was proud beyond measuring that her voice did not move, does the dock have? Tan's face did something brief and complicated. Surprise, and the suppression of surprise, and underneath it, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or might only have been arithmetic coming out even. Scullery, to start, she said. Nobody starts anywhere else. Signs at the galley hatch, shift bells at 6. I'll have someone find you boots. She did not sleep the first night. The bunk was clean and the curtain was thick, but the dock never went quiet. It breathed all night. Hums and thumps and the long groan of gantries taking up load, voices passing, somebody laughing on the far side of the plating. The deep periodic shudder, she would learn, was the mass driver clearing the outbound lane. A palace at night was a held breath. A dock at night was a sleeping animal, and it turned over and it dreamed. She lay in the steel drawer in a borrowed thermal shirt with her gown folded under the bunk like a body, and she did what she had been trained to do with fear, which was to make it stand in a corner and answer questions. Item, she was alive, uncrushed, owed to a stranger's knife. Item, her family did not yet know she was missing. For 19 days, in the candle hall of the Solent's throne, in front of the registry of 2 crowns, there had been a procession with no bride at the end of it. The thought had a strange double weight. Horror? Yes, and underneath the horror, lying very still so as not to be noticed, something she refused to name. It felt disgracefully like reprieve. Item, Prince Edamar would send for her. The Solent's throne kept a flotilla for exactly such dignities, and a flotilla under sublight would take most of the season to arrive, and it would arrive commanded by some envoy with a staff of office and a voice like scented oil, and until either it or the ring's new coil was ready, she was a woman in a steel drawer who had signed a galley roster. Item, and this one she turned over slowly, in the dark, with the care her tutors had taught her to give to any blade. No one on this dock had knelt, not one being, in the 9 hours since the hook. They had been brisk, decent, busy. The station master had said, Your Highness, the way one says a street name. And the young man in the count lane had looked at her for 1 full second, seen that she was not bleeding, and gone back to his numbers, as if a princess were simply a kind of weather that had briefly happened to his shift. She had been taught that a court's regard was the air a royal breathed. She was 9 hours into the vacuum, and she was somehow still breathing. The shift bell at 6 sounded like the end of the world. She was standing at the galley hatch when it rang, in borrowed boots half a size large, with her hair bound back in the only style she knew that needed no maid, which happened to be the mourning braid of the orbital court. It seemed fitting. Something had certainly died. The cook was a vast, calm man called Bell, which she assumed was a joke until she learned it was simply his name. And he looked at her hands for a long moment when she presented them. Lacquered nails, investiture rings of soft gold, palms that had never carried anything heavier than a scepter and the weight of a realm's expectation. "Rings off, or they'll be at the bottom of the third soup vat by noon," Bell said. "Can you carry? I can learn." "That's the only right answer to anything on this dock," Bell said, and handed her a tray of 200 forks. Here is what the third daughter of the veiled sovereign learned in her first 10 days on Pelham Reach, in the order she learned it. That 200 forks weigh more at the end of a shift than the beginning, by some physics no calibrant could explain. That a scalded hand must be run under cold water at once, and not, as instinct insisted, hidden behind the back as one did at court with any weakness. That the gloves they finally found her, riggers' undergloves, too big, sweat-stained at the palm, were worth more than every ring she had posted. Into the station master's sealed locker, because the gloves were given by a woman named D. Okafor who ran Deck 9's day shift and who had watched her drop a pan and pick it up wrong-handed twice. That dock script came as paper chits soft as cloth from handling, and that her first week's pay came to 11 chits and change, and that she stood holding them in the script line for so long, looking at them, that the welder behind her, an old man called Garn with a beard like a burnt forest, said gently, "First money, kid," and she said yes, before she remembered to be anyone, and the whole line nodded, unsurprised, as if the dock had seen every kind of person arrive at that particular moment and considered it a normal port of entry. That the young man from the count lane was called Joss Renner, that he was 24 years old, that he was the senior rigger on Deck 9 despite his age, and that when he came through Bell's line each morning, he said thank you to whoever served him every single time with 1 second of full attention, the same second he had given her, which was, she came to understand, not a small currency. On a dock everyone was busy. A full second was what they had instead of bowing. That nobody on Pelham Reach cared, in any way her instruments could detect, that she was a princess. They cared whether she came back the second day. They cared whether the forks were clean. The third morning, Bell stopped checking her trays. He did not say anything about it. The checking stopped, and she went back to her bunk that night and lay in the dark feeling the absence of his inspection glowing in her chest like a medal, and thought, "I have been given the order of the unwatched tray," and laughed once, alone, into the pillow, and then unexpectedly wept, and felt better afterward than she had since the hook. And she learned the dock's other law, the one not posted at any hatch. She learned it on the 8th day, when a deckhand 2 seats down the mess table, a boy of perhaps 17, Tomas, with grease still in the creases of his knuckles, fell asleep sitting upright with a spoon in his hand, and the entire table conspired in silence, moving cups and conversations around him like water around a stone, and D. Okafor draped her own coat over his shoulders without breaking the sentence she was saying to Garn about manifest codes. No one mocked him, no one woke him. He had pulled a double shift covering for a hand with a sick child, and the table had decided, without a word being spoken, that he had earned 10 minutes inside his own exhaustion. Oriah sat very still, watching the coat, and a thought arrived in her with the force of a docking collision. She had grown up in the most refined court in the weft. She had been taught the 400 forms of address, the 11 depths of the curtsy, the grammar of fans, and the diplomacy of seating charts, and every one of those forms, she had been told, existed to honor worth. And in 19 years inside the veil, she could not remember a single courtier draping a coat over a sleeping servant. These people have etiquette, she thought. It is only that theirs is load-bearing. She began after that to watch the dock the way she had been trained to watch a court. And that was when everything changed, because it turned out that watching was the one labor she had been bred to. She watched D. Okafor run the day shift like a chamberlain of a working house, and saw that the morning assignments were a seating chart, who could stand beside whom, which 2 riggers were feuding over a scriptet and had to be kept on opposite cranes, which crane operator. Wex, a long-limbed man who talked to his machine like a horse, grew sloppy when bored and had to be fed the difficult lifts. She watched the tally mistress, Priya Nunn, keep the book, the great greasy ledger of record into which every hand's lifts and hours, and saw that the book was not accounting, it was heraldry. Your line in the book was your name, your standing, your history. Disputes died the moment Priya's finger came down on a line. Hands 20 years dead were still spoken of by what their pages showed. And she watched Joss Renner work the count lane, calling numbers into the iron roar, and finally asked Garn the question that had been growing in her for 2 weeks. "What is he counting?" Garn followed her eyes. "Everything," he said. "Containers in the lane, hands on the deck, seconds on a swing. counts the dock's heartbeat. Every load that moves, somebody owns the count on it. You call it so the deck knows what's moving, and the next hand knows what's coming. Lose the count, and you get, he stopped. He scratched under the burnt forked beard. You get what we got 11 years back, he said, and did not say what they had gotten 11 years back. And she had been raised never to walk through a door a person had so visibly closed, so she bowed to it invisibly, the smallest of the 11 depths, and let it be. On the 19th day, the day her message reached the Iridal relay, the day her mother learned, in whatever room and whatever light, that her third daughter had not arrived at her own wedding. Oriah carried the dinner urns to Deck 9 because the runner was sick, and stood for a moment at the yellow line where she had once been set down like freight, and watched the gantries swing their 60-ton dancers through the amber dark, and heard Joss Renner's voice threading through it, steady as a metronome, 61, 62. He saw her. He did not stop counting, but he raised the tally counter an inch toward her, unmistakably a half salute, the dock's full second compressed into brass, and turned back to the lane. She carried the urns back through the racket with her spine absurdly straight, and could not for the life of her have said why. The trouble began, as trouble did everywhere in the civilized galaxy, with a manifest. On the 22nd day, the Hallmark Combine poached 6 hands off Pelham Reach in a single afternoon. They did it legally, with transfer bonuses and a chartered shuttle, and they did it loudly, the Combine's factor. A smooth-faced man named Dre, who wore a clean coat the way the envoy class wore staffs of office, standing at the berthing hatch shaking hands while the 6 carried their kits past everyone they were, leaving shorthanded. Oriah watched from the galley line as D. Okafor read the revised crew roster, and watched the shift boss's face do the thing the calibrant's posture had done under the dead ring. A disaster too large for blame. Crush season starts in 40 days, Garn told her, low over the urn. Triple convoys, back-to-back, the whole quarter's tonnage through this spur. Same week, near enough, the Carriers Guild audits our charter. Hands short, schedule fat, auditors on deck. He nodded at the departing shuttle, lights dwindling against the amber. Combine doesn't have to break this dock, see? Just has to be standing close, looking clean when we stumble. Why this dock? Oriah asked. There are docks at 50 rings. There's docks at 50 rings, and there's one ring getting a brand new anchor coil. New coil means 100 years of guaranteed traffic. Garn's eyes crinkled at her over the beard. You're the most valuable wreck in the quadrant, kid. Everything wants a piece of where you fell. That night she did not stand in the script line. She walked the long way around the spur instead, past the dark ring where the calibrant's lamps moved like fireflies over the dead lattice. And she stood at a viewport with her 11 soft chits in her pocket, and conducted, formally, in the high silence of her own skull, the first council of war of her exile. Her tutors had taught her that a royal person was an instrument of the realm, and that the realm was wherever the royal person stood. It was meant as a lesson about dignity abroad. Standing at the viewport in rigger's undergloves, she chose to take it as deployment orders. In the morning, she went to D. Okafor and asked to be moved from the galley to the decks. Okafor looked at her the way Bell had looked at her hands. Deckworks tonnage and vacuum drill, Highness. It eats soft people. I'm aware. I have watched it eat 6 of yours this week. That landed. Okafor's jaw shifted. Oriah kept her voice in the register her tutors called petitioner's iron. Low even. Impossible to dismiss as either begging or command. You are 6 hands short with crush season in 40 days. I am 1 hand. I am likely the least useful hand on this spur, and I will still be 1 more than you have. Teach me the work, and I will do the work until the day the ring takes me, and the book can say what it says. And what do you want out of it? It was a fair dock question. Everything on the dock was a manifest. Nothing moved unaccounted. She gave it the true answer, which surprised her on its way out. Passage I have not been handed, she said. Everything in my life arrived ahead of me, Boss Okafor. The bunk I sleep in is the first thing I have ever been given for something I did. I find I want to know how much of a person can be built that way. Okafor was quiet a moment. Then she reached into her coat, pulled out a folded strip of orange cloth, a trainee's armband, the same one every green hand wore, and held it out. And Oriah understood that she was being offered the dock's only investiture. Bell says you learn, Okafor said. 6 sharp, Renner's Lane. He trains my green hands. Why his lane? Because nobody dies in it, Okafor said, and walked off down the racket of the deck. Joss Renner trained her the way the dock did everything, without ceremony, without cruelty, and without the faintest indication that her rank existed. The first morning he handed her a harness, watched her put it on wrong, took it off her, put it on her right, and said again, and she dressed and undressed in webbing 11 times until her hands knew it without her eyes, while around them the deck hooted and whistled exactly once, one wit calling something about royal lessons, and stopped forever after Joss turned. and looked at the Whitfors 1 full second. Nothing was said. The deck went back to its iron. She filed that away too, on Pelham Reach. Authority was spent like script, in exact amounts, never in display. She learned the gantry lanes, the load math, the brutal poetry of momentum. Mass forgives nothing, Joss told her, the closest thing to a sermon she ever heard from him. He said it the first time she watched a 60-ton container glide past at walking pace and understood, suddenly and bodily, that it could not stop, that nothing that size stops, that the whole dance of the deck was the art of never needing it to. She learned the hand signals, vacuum talk, glove code, the language of palms and fists that worked where radios drowned. And here a strange thing happened, the first strange thing, because glove code was a fan language. It was smaller, harder, honest, but it was grammar spoken with the hands across a noisy room, and she had been drilled in the fan grammars of 4 courts since the age of 6. She learned glove code in 3 days. It took most green hands a season. Joss watched her answer a triple relay signal off Wex's crane, caught, confirmed, lane 2, walking pace, flicked through her fingers without a hitch, and he looked at her hands for a moment the way Bell once had, but inverted. Not what have these never done, but what else do these know? Where'd you learn to talk like that, he asked. At balls, she said, aimed over shoulders mostly, about which minister was lying. A thing she had not seen before happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the rumor of one, the place a smile would stand if he ever let one through. Same job, he said, and turned back to the lane, and she stood there absurdly warm in the cold of the deck, decorated for the second time with an order no herald would ever record. The accident came on the 31st day, and afterward even the book, which did not editorialize, gave it 3 full lines. It was a small mistake, as the deadly ones always were. Thomas, the boy of the borrowed coat, 17, pulling extra shifts again because the dock was short, clipped his tether to a jump line that a departing hand should have flagged dead and hadn't. When the lane shifted and the deck crews swung across the gap on their lines, his deadline paid out exactly nothing and arrested him mid-swing over the open freight lane. And the jolt knocked the wind and the sense out of him, and there he hung, directly down lane of an inbound 60-ton mover with 400 meters of rail between him and it. Oriah saw it whole. That was the thing about her, the thing 19 years of the Vale had built without asking her permission. In the half-second of the deck's first shout, while every head turned, she saw the whole room. She saw the inbound mass that could not stop. She saw Joss already moving, fast and futile, 3 lanes over, too far. She saw Wex frozen at his crane controls with the wrong load on his hook. She saw the brake runner's station unmanned because the brake runner had carried his kit onto a combine shuttle 9 days ago. And she saw what a court sees, which is not objects but precedents. What must happen before what? She did not freeze. Her body had been trained for 11 years by masters of deportment whose whole science was this: that panic is a posture, and posture can be commanded. Wex, she called, and the voice that came out of her was not the galley girl's. It was the voice that had opened the Iredell Summer Games before 40,000 beings, pitched to carry across marble and down generations, and the deck heard it the way decks hear klaxons. Drop the hook, dead lane 5. Her hands were already flying the same order in glove code. Triple relay in case the noise ate the words. Garn brake station, lane 1 now. Joss net, not the boy, the net. Because that was the geometry no one mid-sprint could see. Joss could not reach Tomas in time, but he could reach the cargo net racked at the lane mouth. Wex could not lift the boy free on a fouled hook, but a dead hook dropped in lane 5 tripped the lane's collision governor, which shaved the mover's approach speed by 1/3. Not enough to stop it, nothing stops it, but enough to add 9 seconds. And 9 seconds was enough for Garn's fists on the manual brake to add 6 more. And 15 seconds was enough for Joss to reach the net, swing it on its davit out under the boy like a sail, cut the dead line with the same one-pull motion that had once cut a princess out of a gown, and drop Tomas 11 feet into webbing as the mover groaned past close enough to take the davit's paint. The deck stood in the ringing aftermath, every hand frozen in place by the nearness of it. The mover slid on down its rail, oblivious, vast, indifferent as weather. Tomas lay in the net making the sound of a creature relearning air, and Joss Renner stood on the davit base, tally counter still in his fist, looking across 4 lanes at the galley princess in the orange armband who had just run his deck for 15 seconds, looking at her with an expression she had never once in 19 years seen aimed at herself. Not at her title, not at her gown or her name or her mother's shadow. At her, at the thing she had just done with nothing but eyes and voice and grammar. He raised the tally counter and clicked it once, and pointed at her, counted. It went into the book that night in Priya Nunn's tall iron hand, the lines that said hands and seconds in the governor trip, and at the end where the book named names, call by O Seneval deckhand, good call. Priya read it aloud before she inked it, because that was the custom for lines with names in them, and the mess went quiet to hear, and when it was done, Okafor said, "So entered," and the mess thumped the tables once altogether, a single beat like a heart, and went back to its dinner. That was all. It was the largest honor Araya had ever been paid. She understood something that night, washing the shake out of her hands at the long trough sink, while the adrenaline left her like a tide. The court had decorations for everything, for birth, for beauty, for surviving one's relatives. They were given in advance on credit, against the worth one was presumed to carry in the blood. The dock had exactly one decoration, and it was a line in a greasy ledger that said what you did, written the day you did it, witnessed by everyone whose life had been inside your hands. You could not inherit it. You could not be born owed it. It was the first currency she had ever touched that no one could mint but her. Tomas found her in the script line at week's end. He was 17 and terrible at this, which made it worth more. He stood in front of her, working his jaw, and finally said, "My mother's on Greaves' spur. I'm what she's got so." He stuck out his hand with the grease and the knuckle creases that never washed out. Tomas Ruiz. He knew her name. The whole spur knew her name. It was the most famous name on the dock. He was offering her the other kind, the kind you traded with your hand out, the working name, person to person. Dead acknowledged. She took his hand, callous to forming callous. "Aurea," she said. And then, because court grammar was load-bearing too when you aimed it right, "Your mother is owed a letter describing your conduct. She will have one under my seal." You don't have to. I am told," Araya said gravely, "that I am allowed to do things because I wish to. It's been quite a season for discoveries." Around them the script line laughed, with her, not at her. She could tell the difference now, the way she could tell a live line from a dead one. And behind the laughter she caught sight of Joss at the board by the hatch, posting the next day's assignments, his eyes on her for one full second across the room, two perhaps. The rumor at the corner of his mouth was almost news. The letters from her own world arrived on the 40th day, the relay's first round, trip since her fall, and they arrived, as everything from her world did, as a procession. There were 11 of them under the orbital seal, decanted from the relay packet into the station master's office, printed on leaf so fine the dock's air seemed to bruise it. Tan handed the folder over without comment, though her eyebrows had opinions. Her mother's letter ran 4 pages and said, in the way the veil said everything, almost nothing. Gratitude to Fortune for her daughter's preservation, instruction to comport herself as a daughter of the veil in all things, assurance that the throne of Solence had been gracious in its patience. Underneath the formulas, to an eye trained on her mother's hand, ran the true text, the realm's text. The marriage was the realm's western shield. The Solence lanes carried half of Iridel's grain. Nothing has changed, the unwritten line said. The ring failed, the alliance did not. Stand where you fell, and be retrieved and be wed. Her sister Marin's letter was 1 page, and was the only one in the packet written by a person. The wedding hall stood 3 hours with no bride, and Idamar's aunt fainted into the ice swans, it said. You always were the only one of us with a sense of theater. They tell me you have been carried off by stevedores. Write and tell me everything true, because nothing here is. And the 11th letter bore the wax of the Solence throne, and was from First Envoy Hadri's Vorn, and announced in 900 words of scented oil that he personally would have the honor of commanding the retrieval flotilla even now being fitted, that her radiance need only endure, that the throne, grieved to learn its promised princess, had been reduced by mischance to circumstances of labor among the freight castes, and that all evidence of said circumstances would of course be handled with the most perfect discretion, for her protection, and the throne's honor, and the dignity of both crowns. Araya read that letter twice. Then she folded it along lines of her own choosing, walked to the galley, and asked Bel's permission, everything in Bel's kingdom moved by his leave, to feed it to the burn bin where the grease rags went. Bad news? Bel asked. A weather report, she said, watching the leaf catch. There's a season coming when I'll be told my own name. Crush season came down on Pelham Reach like a tide on a low town, and it came down 6 hands short. The first triple convoy filled the sky on the 44th day, 90 human freighters in slow procession against the amber, each one a city block of riveted hunger, all of them needing to be unloaded, sorted, transferred, and turned around inside a schedule written by people who had never stood on a deck. Tan posted the tonnage targets at every hatch. Garn read them, took off his cap, and put it back on backward, which Araya had learned was the welder's equivalent of a long blasphemy. The dock began to grind. Doubles became standard. Sleep became scrip, borrowed, and lent. By the 50th day, the strain showed where strain always shows first, not in the lifts, but in the lines. The mess lines, the script lines, the shift change crush at the berthing hatch where 200 exhausted bodies tried to pass through 4 doors in 9 minutes. Tempers shortened. Two riggers came to blows over a borrowed torque bar. Bell's soup ran out twice in 1 week at the end of the line, and the hands at the end of the line were the ones coming off the worst shifts. And on the second night, a deckhand stood holding her empty tray and simply cried, standing up, too tired for shame, and the whole mess looked at its boots. Oriah lay in her bunk that night, listening to the doc breathe rough, and held a council of war with herself for the second time. Then she got up, took her grease pencil, and did the only thing she had been raised to do. She planned a banquet. She did not call it that. She brought it to D. Okafor and Priya Nund as 3 pages of grease pencil titled Service Rotation, and what it was underneath was the seating doctrine of the Orbital Court translated into doc, the science of moving the most beings through the least space with the least friction, and no one's dignity left on the floor, ceasing staggered by deck instead of by shift bell, so the line never doubled. The exhausted fed first, not by rules shamed, but by geometry. The hardest shift deck seated nearest the galley, a thing no one would notice and everyone would feel. Soup vat split front and back of the line so the end of the line ate the same meal as the front. The shift change crush dissolved with a page from processional doctrine. You do not move 200 bodies through 4 doors in 1 wave. You move them in 3 waves of 70, and the waves are announced not by a bell, which is an order, but by a board, which is information. And tired people forgive information. And 1 more page, which she almost did not include. At the Vale, every 10-day, the sovereign held audience hour. Any subject might stand before the throne and be heard on any grievance, and the genius of it, her mother's genius, was not mercy. It was pressure mapping. A realm that is heard does not rupture. A court that listens knows where the cracks run before they open. Pelham Reach had no such valve. Complaints went up the chain like everything else, and the chain was busy. So her last page proposed, in doc grammar, a grievance table. Last hour of mess, 2 evenings at 10-day. Boss Okafor or her delegate sitting at the corner table with the book open. Anyone could sit down. Whatever was said got a line. Okafor read all 3 pages twice in silence in the empty mess at shift's end. Then she looked up, and the arithmetic in her face had a new figure in it. This is court stuff, she said, isn't it? Under the paint. It is 400 years of my family managing crowds in tight rooms, Oriah said. Painted. Why's it work? Because etiquette was never about forks, boss. It is the engineering of friction. Mine is simply the only cargo I came aboard with. Okafor ran the rotation on Deck 9 for 1 10-day as a trial. Throughput at the mess rose, the line fights stopped, and the grievance table, which the deck named, instantly and forever, the complaints department, with a hand-lettered sign Wex made as a joke, and Okafor refused to take down, surfaced in its first 2 sittings, 1 festering script debt, 1 genuinely dangerous shortcut the night shift had been taking past the mass driver interlocks to save 4 minutes. And the fact that Tomas Ruiz had been pulling shifts for 2 hands and sending both pays to Greaves Spur and eating once a day. The debt got settled, the shortcut got killed before it killed someone, and Tomas got marched to Bell's line by Garn personally, with the welder's hand on his collar like a tug on a barge. But the worst night of crush season was the 56th, when a guidance fault in the approach grid stacked 9 freighters in holding for 13 hours, and the doc learned what Oriah already knew from a childhood of state funerals. That the hardest crowd to manage is the one that can do nothing but wait. The freighters were family boats, most of them, crews of cousins and married pairs and grandmothers who had flown the grain routes for 40 years and 13 hours of drifting. Outside a dock too slammed to take them put a fray in the channels that everyone could hear, the particular fray of people whose whole year's margin was burning fuel in a holding pattern. Some of those boats carried children. All of them carried debts. It was not her lane and not her problem. She was 11 hours into a double herself. But she stood at the operations rail listening to the channel fray, and the oldest grammar she owned stood up in her, the one from before the fans and the forks, the first thing the Vale teaches its daughters about a realm. When people are frightened and helpless, the crown talks to them, not at them, to them by name so they know they are held in someone's count. She asked Tan for the channel, and Tan, who by the 56th day gave her anything that wasn't bolted down, handed it over. And for the back half of that night, while the grid crews fought the fault, the holding pattern above Pelham Reach was talked to, boat by boat, name by name, in a voice trained to carry calm across marble for generations. The Marantide first, because she'd learned its master's name at the apron, then the Cassiel, the long patience, the 2 brothers, each one given the truth, which is the rarest courtesy, your slot, your sequence, what failed, what's being done, who is doing it, and given, between the facts, the other thing, the thing the channel fray had really been asking for. Someone awake who knew they were there. She took requests for Bell's galley to have hot food at the locks when they finally berthed. She relayed a chess move between two masters who had a board running across 3 years of convoys. Near fourth bell, at the request of a grandmother on the Cassiel, she recited an Iridel night blessing over the open channel for a sleepless 7-year-old in high Iridel and then in trade tone. May the dark hold its lanes, may the watch hold its count, and half the holding pattern, the dock learned later, had turned its receivers up to hear it. The grid came back at fifth bell. The 9 boats berthed without one harsh word logged, and the convoy families being what they were, the carrying kind. The story went up and down, the routes with the grain, so that for years afterward, boats Oriah had never met would check in at Pelham Reach approach with the same first question asked in the tone of people inquiring after their own. Is the princess on watch? Tan made the rotation standard across Pelham Reach on the 60th day. She came down to the deck 9 mess to say so, and she said it from the front of the room, in front of the assembled shift, with her thumbs in her coat pockets. Whole spurs on the Seneval rotation as of tomorrow, she said. That's what it's called in the standing orders. That's what it'll be called when the guild asks me how a dock 6 hands short is beating its tonnage targets. Credit where the book can see it. She put a chit on the table in front of Oriah, a foreman's chit brass, the kind that hung at Okafor's belt. Day shift deck 9 ratings crew. Yours Highness. Okafor's been running you as a crew lead for 10 days anyway. We're just done pretending otherwise. The mess thumped the tables once, all together. Oriah closed her hand around the brass while it was still warm from the station master's pocket, and she had stood beneath crowns, literal crowns, in treasuries older than the human species, and not one of them had weighed anything like this. One condition, Tan added, dry as vacuum. The complaints department keeps its sign. The brass chit changed the work, and the work kept teaching. Running a ratings crew, she discovered inside the first 10 day was the only job in the universe she had been completely educated for. The morning assignment was a seating chart. She drew it like one, and the feud between the rigger Asa Okonjo and the loader Pavel Reyes, 8 months old, script-rooted, immune to 3 direct orders from 2 bosses, died in 4 days because she never once addressed the feud. She simply assigned them, with a chamberlain's invisible hand, to interdependent stations where each man's tally looked better every time the other did well, and let arithmetic do what orders couldn't. Okafor watched the 2 of them sharing a thermos at the lane mouth on the 5th morning and said, "How?" "At court we call it a marriage of houses," Oriah said. "You arrange the interests and let the affection follow at its own pace. It is the single most reliable instrument my civilization owns. That a fact. Boss, it is the instrument my civilization made me of." Some of her grammar moved into the deck's bones and stopped being hers. The crews learned that the new lead received grievances best at the end of shift, walking her lanes, audience hour on the move, and that a complaint brought with its facts in order got action by morning, and a complaint brought as theater got her most courteous attention, which they rapidly learned to dread, courtesy being, in her hands, an instrument with edges. The green hands learned that she returned every salute-shaped thing they invented for her, a knuckle to the hatch frame, 2 fingers off the hard hat, with the exact formality of a throne room, perfectly deadpan, until the invention stopped being mockery and became, without anyone agreeing to it, the deck's own usage. Wex's crane acquired in stencil beneath 19 years of cargo tallies the words Lady Patience, because Oriah had once, in passing, addressed the machine as one addresses a dowager duchess, with titles, flattery, and unbroken eye contact, while Wex fought a fouled sheave, and the sheave had freed. And Wex now refused to begin a difficult lift without what he called the formalities, and once, only once, but the book noted it, her old grammar carried a load whole. A grain freighter's master, choleric with schedule, came down the ramp shouting tonnage precedence at the transfer clerks, demanding his lift slots ahead of a hospital resupply, and the shouting was working, because the clerks were 19 and tonnage was tonnage. Oriah crossed the apron, presented herself with the full 11-degree inclination due a ship's master from a crown's officer, and in the high Iridal ceremonial register, which he did not speak, but which nobody alive could hear without standing up straighter, delivered 30 unbroken seconds of what was, in literal content, the procession order of the Feast of Veils, and in tone, function, and effect, a sovereign's reminder that precedence descends from the realm, and the realm was standing in front of him, asking after the hospital. The master unshouted. The hospital ship loaded first. Garn, who had watched the entire engagement from the gantry like a man at theater, asked her afterward what she'd actually said, and she told him, and he laughed until he had to sit on a brake shoe. "You read him the menu," he said, wiping his eyes. "With conviction," she agreed. Etiquette, Master Garn, was never about the forks. It was Priya Nun's needlewomen who found the gown. There was no privacy on a berthing deck worth the name, and the bundle under her bunk had been an open secret for a season. Veil silk, court cut, Hook torn, folded like a body, and on the night of the 60th day Oriah returned from shift to find it gone, and stood for a moment at her bunk with her heart conducting itself strangely, and followed the trail of guilty looks to the mess annex, where Priya's circle, the off-shift menders who kept the dock's suits and flags and Belle's aprons alive, had it spread across 3 pushed-together tables under the good lights, and were examining the blind sister's seam work with the reverence of calibrants at a coil. "The tier's clean," Priya said, not looking up by way of complete explanation. "Renner cuts like a surgeon, I'll give him that. We can have it whole by audit season." "Sit down, Highness. Nobody here can read this stitch. You'll translate." So she sat in the warm annex with the menders, translating the grammar of the 9 blind sisters into dock, load stitch, tension stitch. This seam floats, this seam bears, and found her own eyes stinging, unexpectedly and hard, at the sight of grease-creased human hands repairing, with perfect competence and no awe at all, the most sacred object her old life had sent through the ring with her. They were not restoring a relic. They were fixing a garment, because it was torn, because it was hers, because that was what the hands of Pelham Reach did with broken things that belonged to their people. "Why," she asked Priya finally, "would you spend your off-shifts on this?" "I'll never wear it on a deck." Tied off a thread, bit it, and looked at her over the work, iron-spined, amused. "Same reason you write Ruiz's mother under seal," she said. "Dignity's cargo too, girl. Somebody's got to keep it moving." There was a night, too, that she entered in no letter, though she turned it over more often than anything the season gave her. Her vacuum certification, every crew lead held one. Finished with a walk, out the deck 9 personnel lock, down the spur spine on magnet boots, under the working stars. Joss took her out because he trained Okafor's green hands, and they stood on the iron skin of the dock with the gas giant filling half of everything, amber and ancient and indifferent, and the convoy lights crawling their slow rivers against it, and the dead ring above them a circle of darker dark, waiting for its coil. Glove code only out there. The radio was for working words. She watched his hands in her helmet light. "Look," he signed, plain dock sign, turning her by the shoulder to face down the spur's whole length. The gantries, the berths, the lit thread of the mass driver rail. The small moving sparks that were people, hundreds of people, hauling civilization hand over hand in the dark. "Yours," she signed. Meaning, is this what you wanted to show me? Meaning, whose is all this? Meaning several things, her hands let blur together the way hands could and voices couldn't. He considered the question longer than glove code needed. Then, in his exact economy, he signed back the only sentence she ever counted as his confession. 3 signs, load-rated, unanswerable, caught, confirmed, walking pace. Somewhere in the same 10 days, she could never afterward find the seam, the place where it had started, which her tutors would have said is the definition of good engineering. The hours with Joss Renner stopped being training and became the spine the rest of the day hung from. It was never named. That was the first thing to understand about it. The doc did not name things before they were load tested, and neither did he. It was an accumulation of small mass. He taught her splices in the slack half hour after shift, the 2 of them at the rigging bench with wire and cable ends. And a splice cannot be taught at arm's length. You stand close, 4 hands on one line, and he would say turn, tuck, set, and watch her hands instead of the wire, because the hands were what he was training. She learned his economy. He never said 2 words where one carried. He never touched anything, cable or crane or person, with more force than the job took. And his attention, that single full second he paid out like scrip, came to her now in sums that would have beggared the deck if attention were really money. 3 seconds. 5. Once, when she made a long splice on the first try and looked up, 8, 9, an entire fortune, paid in silence over a rigging bench, while the dock roared softly somewhere else. She told him about the veil in pieces, and he took the pieces the way he took load, tested for weight, never dropped. She told him about the fan grammars, and he had her teach him 6 signals, then used one across the deck a 10-day later, over the shoulders, which minister is lying, aimed at a guild scheduling officer, deadpan, mid-meeting, and she had to convert her laugh into a cough so violently that Priya wrote her a line for vacuum exposure. She told him, once, at the bench, late, why her braid was a morning braid, that it was the only style she'd known how to do alone, that first night, and that she'd kept it because something had in fact died and nobody here had thought to tell her grief was bad posture. He was quiet a while. Then he said, "First thing my mother taught me was the count, and that was the night she got the door Garn had closed. Calla Renner had been the best crane op on Pelham Reach for 19 years. The breakaway, 11 years back, had not been her mistake. A relief op on lane 1 had lost his count, called a lane clear that wasn't, and 40 tons had come off a failed davit into the sorting bay. Calla had seen it coming the way the best ones do, half a second before physics published it, and she had spent her half second swinging her own hook into the falling load's path, knocking it 11 degrees off true, out of the bay mouth where 9 hands were sorting, into the empty lane where there was only ever going to be room for one more. The book gave her 6 lines. Joss was 13 when Priya read them to the mess, and the mess thumped the tables once, and he had hated that sound for about a year, he said, and then stopped hating it, because his mother had written most of her page herself, lift by lift, day by day, and the last line was simply the kind of thing that happens to the best pages if you keep adding to them long enough. That's the count, he said, eyes on the wire in his hands. People think it's about cargo. Cargo's fine. Cargo does what mass does. The count is, there's people on this deck, and every one of them is somebody's whole sky. You count what's moving so you never have to find out what the sky weighs. He set the splice, tested it, passed it back to her. You ran my deck with your voice, day 31, knew the geometry cold. But that's not why I pointed the counter at you. Why then? Counted the boy first, Joss said. Princess in a borrowed armband, 4 lanes out, and the first number you called was the one with a person in it. He stood, racked the wire, shouldered his kit, all his usual punctuation for good night. At the hatch he paused, not turning, and the words came out with the exact care of a man laying a load down in a tight space. Whatever they grew you for, over there, they grew better than they knew. He was gone down the corridor before she had any voice at all. After that night she understood her own situation perfectly, with the same cold clarity she'd have brought to anyone else's. She was the betrothed instrument of an alliance that fed half her realm. There was a flotilla decelerating toward this dock with her name on its manifest. There was a coil regrowing in the dark lattice above her. Hour by hour, that would open a door home that duty would walk her through. And there was a man who paid attention like scrip, who had seen her, not the third daughter, not the radiance, her, the one who counted the boy first, and seeing her had asked her for nothing, not once, not a promise, not a thing she could not give, not even, she realized with a slow astonishment, her time she had given that. He had only ever made room in the veil. Everyone who looked at her wanted something, and her whole education was the management of that wanting. She had no doctrine at all for a man who wanted her to have what was hers. Marin's next letter, they wrote every relay window now, 2 pages of true things crossing 19 days of dark, said it the way Marin said everything. You realize you described this rigor the way the rest of us were taught to describe the sovereign. Power held in reserve, attention as grant of favor, terror of asking lest it be treated as command. Sister dearest, you are not falling into anything. You are simply standing for the first time somewhere level. The flotilla made orbit on the 70th day, 4 days early, which Oriah knew before any siren sounded because she was on shift when the long scan board lit, and she read the formation the way she read everything. 5 ships in the parade wedge of the Solon's throne, holding ceremonial spacing through a working approach corridor, and the corridor's outbound convoy slots shuffling frantically around their pageantry like servants around a drunk duke. They're flying the wedge through my freight lanes, Tan said, on the operations deck, in a voice that could have etched plate. They will not break it, Oriah said. The wedge is the throne arriving. It does not bend for traffic. She watched the board, and the old grammar rose in her like a second language unused for a season. She could read every banner of that formation, every precedence signal in its running lights, and for the first time in her life she was reading it from underneath. From the deck of the kitchen world it was inconveniencing, and the grammar that had been the architecture of her universe looked, from here, like a man wearing court dress in a machine shop. The flagship will request. It will not be phrased as a request. A state docking at your principal berth, she said, which is berth 1, which is the only berth rigged for the heavy grain transfer this week. Offer them berth 14. 14 is structurally your finest berth. It is also a number of no precedence which the first envoy will swallow, because refusing your best berth requires him to explain the numerology to humans, and explaining is beneath him. She paused. This is the work I was bred for, station master. Use me as you'd use any rated hand. Tan looked at her sideways, and when he asks for you, he will not ask for me first. He will ask for the manifest of my conduct, what I have done, who has seen it, what it has cost the throne's dignity. Me he will summon. Oriah kept her eyes on the wedge crawling across the board, and her voice stayed in petitioner's iron, but the iron had crushed seasoned carbon in it now, and I am crew on this dock until the ring opens or my contract is bought out under dock law. I would like that fact stated to him formally before I am stated to him. Precedence, First Envoy Vorn would tell you, is everything. First Envoy Hadri's Vorn came down to Pelham Reach the way scent comes into a room. He was tall even for a Solence lord, robed in the gray and flame of the throne's diplomatic service, attended by exactly 11 retainers. 11, the precedence number of a crown's property being recovered. And oh, she read that the way Joss read a fouled line, and he stood at the foot of his... shuttle ramp on the deck of berth 14 and looked at the working iron of the dock with the gentle, infinite patience of a man waiting for an unpleasant smell to acknowledge itself. Tan met him with full correctness, which Uriah had spent 2 evenings drilling into the senior staff. The greetings, the spacing, the order of names. It denied him his first weapon. A man like Vorn opened conversations with other beings' mistakes. Station master. His trade tongue was flawless, perfumed, unhurried. The throne thanks you for the preservation of its treasure. I am come to assume custody of the person of Her Radiance, Uriah Seneval, Princess of the Orbital Vale, betrothed of the Solent's throne, and to relieve your establishment, with all gratitude, of a burden it was never fitted to carry. The princess's contract has her rated as crew lead, day shift, deck 9, Tan said. Under the dock charter both our governments signed, a crew contract runs to its term, ring restoration, in this case, unless bought out with the contract holder's consent. The contract holder is the princess. Your Excellency's gratitude is noted in the log. Vorn's smile did not move, but his attention slid past Tan's shoulder, across the working deck, and found Uriah, standing with her crew, in her coveralls and her brass chit and her orange-banded green hands flanking her, 60 feet of stacked freight between her life and his, and what was in his eyes, perfectly visible to anyone trained in the grammar, was inventory, damage assessment, the cataloging of a recovered asset that had been stored regrettably in weather. Radiance, he called, warm as oil. What a costume. How they will weep at court when it is told what was done to you. The deck had gone quiet, hand by hand, crane by crane, not at his arrival. The dock had ignored his arrival professionally, but at his tone, which needed no translation in any language spoken by working people anywhere. Nothing was done to me, First Envoy. Uriah's voice carried down the berth on its trained rails, level, clear, pitched to be heard and remembered. Everything here I did. For a moment, the only sound on berth 14 was the tick of a cooling shuttle hull. Then Vorn laughed, lightly, beautifully, a laugh tuned over decades to make whatever preceded it sound young, and turned back to Tan as if Uriah's sentence had been the charming noise of a pet. Of course, he said. The resilience of the Vale's daughters is the stuff of song. Station Master, my staff will require access protocols, a liaison, and a schedule of Her Radiance's shifts. He let the words sit out in the air, where everyone could see what it was wearing. The throne's patience is a deep treasury, but do let us not spend all of it on theater. He went back up the ramp with his 11 retainers, and the deck watched him go, and Wex said, from his crane into the open channel, in the flat tone of a man reporting traffic, confirm 1 unit moving, 0 tons, and the deck went back to work inside its own laughter, and that was the dock's opening statement in the matter of First Envoy Hadri's Vorn. His was subtler. It arrived over the following days the way damp arrives in a hull, seam by seam. He did not summon her at once. That was the first move of the game as the Vale played it. He made himself a fact in orbit. 5 ships of gray and flame hanging in the amber sky above every viewport, a deadline made of metal, while his staff filed requests through Tan's office with exquisite correctness, for records, for interviews, for a precautionary survey of the royal person's berthing conditions. Each one reasonable, each one a finger testing the dock's seams for the place where patience would tear and give him a grievance to stand on. Uriah answered the survey request herself, in writing, through the log, where everything would be visible to the guild. Crew Lead O. Seneval reports berthing conditions standard and adequate, signed with her contract number, not her style. She heard, through the liaison clerk, that Vorn had held the printout at arm's length like a soiled glove and smiled and said to his aide, she has learned to make noises in their grammar. How resourceful. File it. The aide was the next seam he tested. On the 72nd day, Wex, who noticed everything that moved within crane shot of his cab, it was the whole of his religion, flagged Joss, who flagged Okafor, who walked unhurried, to where a junior member of the Solant's liaison staff stood in the gallery above deck 9 with a recorder crystal cupped discreetly in one gray sleeve, harvesting footage of the Princess of the Orbital Vale hauling chain in a sweat-dark coverall. Everyone on the deck understood the cargo at a glance. At the courts of the Weft, such images were munitions, her radiance reduced, her radiance soiled, her radiance shamed before 2 crowns. The season recut as scandal, ready for whatever rooms the throne screened it in, proof that the bride had been damaged in storage and the dock had done the damaging. The deck also understood with the same glance that gallery access was public under the charter and the recording broke no law of the dock. So the dock broke no law either. Word went down the lanes hand to hand, rollers under a load, and by the time the aide had repositioned for a better angle, Deck 9 had organized, without one audible order, the most damning counter-strike, available to working people anywhere. They made it good footage. Tomas Ruiz drifted into frame and stood beside Uriah's chain station, openly, proudly, the way a man stands next to his crew lead for a unit portrait. Garn's whole welding gang found reasons to cross behind her in echelon, hard hat squared. Wex swung Lady Patience through the shot in salute order with her hook flying the deck's pennant, which had never once flown for an admiral. Okafor walked the lane line and saluted her crew lead in passing. The full 2 fingers off the hard hat, and Araya, understanding at last, set down the chain, turned to face the gallery directly, and gave the recorder crystal the 11-degree inclination of a crown's officer, acknowledging an honor guard, sweat, grease, orange armband, and all. Let the courts read that grammar, her spine said, in the oldest register she owned. Every being in this frame knows exactly who I am. That is rather the point of it. The aide stopped recording. There is no scandal in a woman surrounded by people who are proud of her. The lens simply will not hold it. The picture keeps composing itself into something else. Something the pageant worlds had no file for, and the doc had no word for either, because the doc did not need words for things it did every day. The footage went up to the flagship regardless, because aides file what they harvest. What the throne's archivist eventually labeled it, a guild clerk who saw the manifest later swore on the book, was personnel, morale, subject, context unsuitable. Vorn never mentioned the gallery again, but Araya noted, filed, cross-referenced, in the archive her tutors had built behind her eyes, that the aide who had done the recording was reassigned to the flagship's night watch within a day, and she understood the true lesson of the episode, which was not about footage at all. Vorn punished failure instantly and spent his subordinates like chits, which meant his staff feared him, which meant his reports upward were written to be safe rather than true, which meant the throne, 4 days out from the curtain, did not actually know what was waiting for it at the foot of the ring, a misread that someone, someday soon, in some room with consequences, was going to pay for. She put the observation away with the care her tutors had taught her to give any blade. It would keep. Then, on the 74th day, he came down to the mess during the grievance table and sat down at the complaints department in his gray and flame under Wex's hand-lettered sign with the whole of the evening shift watching over their trays. It was, she had to grant him, superbly played. The grievance table was open to anyone, that was its law, written in her own grease pencil. He had found the one chair on Pelham Reach she could not refuse him. A marvelous institution, he said, settling. As Okafor's delegate at the book, who happened that evening to be Priya-Nund, iron-spined, unimpressed, recorded his presence in tall letters. The Vale's audience hour, performed in a kitchen. Radiance, I have come with a grievance, as your custom requires. May I? Araya set down her tray and sat opposite him. Around them the mess pretended to eat. The table is open, First Envoy. My grievance is this. He folded his long hands. There is a woman aboard this dock holding a labor contract she has no need of at a wage of. He glanced, delicately, at nothing. 11 chits and change a week, while 2 crowns wait upon her, and a Western shield rusts in the reign of her pride. I am authorized to buy out this contract at any figure your station master cares to invent. I am authorized to carry every being on this deck a year's wages as the throne's gratitude. Name the price of the theater, Radiance, and let us all go home to our lives, had stopped pretending to eat. Under dock law, Araya said, a buyout requires the contract holder's consent. You are speaking to her. She declines. She declines. Vorn's voice stayed silk, but he leaned back and addressed the room. That was the move. He had always intended to address the room. Then let the grievance be heard in full, as the custom requires. My grievance is not with the princess. It is with what this place has let her forget. Good people, you have been kind to her, in your fashion. You gave her your clothes and your tools and your little brass token, and you have enjoyed, who would not, the spectacle of a Radiance carrying soup. But every day you indulge this, a bride is missing from a treaty hall, and on the day the Solence lanes close to Iridal Grain, and that day is being discussed, I assure you, in rooms none of you will ever stand in. The children who go hungry will not be on this dock. They will be on her world. 11 chits a week, he said, turning back to her, gentle as a knife going in along the grain, is a heavy price, Radiance, when someone else pays it. It was the truest thing he would ever say to her, and he had said it in front of her crew, and it landed exactly as he had built it to land. She felt the deck's warmth toward her complicate, felt 200 decent people behind her arrive simultaneously at the thought, is that right? Is she costing her own people? Felt, worst of all, the thought arrive in herself, where it had already been living for a season, fed nightly on her mother's unwritten lines. She did not look down. Gravel 6 hours a day, for years. Enter the grievance, tally mistress, she said level, and enter the answer. She turned to face her crew because the answer was owed to them, not him. The First Envoy is correct that my realm's grain crosses Solence space, and correct that the throne can close those lanes, and correct that if it does, my people pay for where I stand. He has omitted only one thing, that this was equally true the day my marriage was contracted. The lanes were the price of the bride. They will be the price of the bride's daughters, and their daughters every generation forever, a realm fed at sufferance one wedding at a time. She let that stand a beat. The mess was silent in a way that had a tension in it, the way the deck went silent when a heavy load swung. I have spent a season learning what this dock knows in its hands, that whatever you cannot carry yourself, someone else owns. My realm cannot carry its own grain, so the throne owns my family one princess at a time and calls the arrangement an alliance, and we curtsy and call it that too. I am not declining the first envoy's buyout out of pride. I am declining because I am no longer certain the cargo on offer is the realm's freedom, and until I am certain, I will not sign for the load. She turned back to Vorn. Grievance answered. The table is open to the next petitioner. There was no next petitioner. There was Garn, rising from his bench with his bowl, walking it deliberately to the rack, and the deck's strange one-beat table thump like a heart, all together, for her at the envoy's expense in his presence. And Vorn rose unhurried into the sound, smoothed the gray and flame, and paid out his exit line with the satisfaction of a man who had, after all, accomplished what he came for. The veil trained you too well, Radiance, he said. You argue like a sovereign. What a waste that you were grown to be a gift. A precise bout of the room, 11 degrees, she measured it. Property recovery protocol to the end. I will be in orbit. The coil, I am told, completes in 23 days. All theater ends when the curtain does. He was right about that, too. That was the poison in him. He was so often right. Her mother's next letter, the relay window of the 80th day, confirmed the squeeze. 3 pages of formulas, and underneath them the realm's true text, darker now. Solent's tariff inspectors had begun schedule reviews on orbital grain convoys. 2 had been held at the border for 9 days. The granary worlds were drawing down stores. There was no threat anywhere in the language. There never is, in good language. There was only her mother's hand, slightly heavier on the downstrokes than in any letter before, and one sentence near the end that no Chamberlain had drafted. You were always the one who saw the board whole, Araya. See it whole now. She read it at the rigging bench after shift, and Joss spliced wire across from her and did not ask, and she handed the page across the bench anyway, because somewhere in the season his silence had become the room where she thought best. He read it slowly. Trade Tong was his second script. He read it twice. They held grain ships 9 days, he said at last, to move you, to weigh me. The holds are a scale. They are establishing, before the curtain, exactly what I cost per day of theater. She took the letter back, folded it on her own lines. It is good statecraft. I was raised inside it. The board is real, Joss. The granaries are real. The children he conjured at my table are real. And in 23 days the ring opens and the road home is 1 step long, and every step after it is paid for by other people. That is what a princess is, did you know? A unit of account. The old anger surprised her, not at Vorn. Vorn was weather, at the architecture, at how well it was built. Joss set down the wire. He was quiet the length of a long splice, and she watched him arrive. She could read him now, the way she read rooms, at the exact place she had been standing for 10 days. At the door of the thing that could not be said, because saying it would be asking, and asking would put one more hand on a person whose whole life had been hands. He did not say it. She watched him pick the thing up, test its weight, and rack it, deliberately, the way he racked a load not his to move. What he said was, whatever you decide it like you decided on day 31. Count the people. Then call the lift. He stood, shouldered his kit, and at the hatch he paused, and for once the punctuation broke its own economy. And wherever you're standing when the door opens, Araya, stand where they can see your hands. You're the only royal in the weft who knows what that's worth. It was the first time he had ever said her name, her working name, the one she had traded callus to callus. No radiance on it, no highness, just the name. Both of them heard it. Neither of them touched it, the way you do not touch a line under load. The Carriers Guild auditors docked on the 89th day. 3 of them, gray-coated, polite as scalpels, with the Combine's factor Dre arriving by separate shuttle 11 hours later, as an interested party of standing, which under guild rules he was entitled to be, and everyone knew what it meant. The audit of Pelham Reach's charter would run 4 days. On its findings rode the dock, every berth, every bunk, every line in the book, and Halmark's people had spent a season sharpening the question they wanted asked. It was Vorn who handed them the blade. On the audit's 2nd day, the first envoy's office transmitted to the guild team unsolicited a statement of concern of the Solent's throne, that Pelham Reach had during the period under review enrolled a stranded royal person into hazardous labor in violation of the comity owed between species. That said person had been present on deck during a near-fatality incident, book reference attached, day 31, and that the throne questioned whether a dock so casual with the dignity of crowns could be trusted with the cargo of 2 civilizations. Dre could not have written it better, and Araya suspected he hadn't had to. She had watched the Factor's shuttle make a courtesy pass by the Solance flagship on its way in. The Combine and the Throne had found their interest braided, fail the dock, take the charter, and the new coil's 100 years of traffic would be unloaded by Halmark hands, and the recovered princess, naturally, would have been long since carried home by then, her embarrassing season expunged from every record the Guild let the Combine keep. Tan read the statement of concern at the operations table with the senior staff around her and Oriah at the foot, and for the first time in 90 days the station master looked briefly old. "They'll ask you about day 31, Tan said. "On the record, under Guild oath, with Dre watching. If you tell it the way the Thrones framed it, royalty endangered, dock negligent, we're done." And, kid, the word, came out of her flat and deliberate, the dock's own grammar for what she meant. If you tell it the other way, you're testifying against the throne you're contracted to marry into. On a Guild record, every court in the Weft can subpoena. There's no third category. Oriah looked down the table, at Okafor, who had given her gloves, at Priya, who had given her lines, at the grease pencil rotation with her name on it, posted by the hatch, at the whole small iron world that had, without one ceremony, made her. "Station master," she said, "I have spent my entire life being prepared for exactly one thing, to give testimony in rooms where the truth has consequences. The Veil calls it being royal." She squared the audit schedule in front of her like a manifest. "Put me on the record." The Guild convened its hearing in the dock's contract hall on the audit's third day, and the room filled the way the mess filled on book-reading nights. Every hand not on shift, standing along the bulkheads, silent, present. Dre sat to the auditor's left with a case of annotated filings. A Solence observer, Vorn did not descend for procedure. Descending was spent like authority, sat to their right with a recorder crystal glowing on the table like a coal. The senior auditor, a small gray woman named Pell with a voice like a fine dry file, ran the hearing as audits run. Tonnage logs, safety logs, the book itself carried in on its stand by Priya as if it were an ark. The numbers, against 6 missing hands in a crush season, were not merely defensible. They were the best on the Spurs circuit, and everyone in the room knew which 3 grease pencil pages had done it. And Pell's file-dry voice noting throughput anomalies, positive was the closest a Guild auditor came to applause. Then came the statement of concern, read into the record in the Throne's perfume, and the room's temperature dropped to working vacuum. "The Guild calls the royal person referenced," Pell said. "Conduct of the dock towards said person being material to charter fitness. You may decline, Highness, comedy provides." "The witness declines to decline," Oriah said, and took the chair. She had dressed for it with a courtier's malice aforethought, not the gown. The gown lay folded under her bunk, where it had lain for 90 days. But her working coveralls, laundered to parade order, the brass foreman's chit at her collarbone where a ducal order would have hung, the orange trainee's band which she had never removed around her left arm. Let the recorder crystal carry that composition to whatever court subpoenaed it. She had learned dress as a language before she could write. She had simply never before had anything true to say in it. "State your standing," Pell said. Oriah Seneval, crew lead, day shift, deck 9, Pelham Reach, under contract of the 12th day of the season. A beat measured also, third daughter of the veiled sovereign of Iridal, princess of the Veil, betrothed of the Solence throne. I am advised those titles attached to this testimony. I attach them. The statement before the Guild alleges this dock enrolled you in hazardous labor in violation of comedy. Did it? No. I petitioned for the work twice against the advice of the dock's own officers, who warned me of its hazards with a candor I had never previously received from any being on any subject. She let the room hear the shape of that sentence land. "The statement has a transaction inverted, Madam Auditor. This dock did not reduce a princess to labor. It extended to a stranded foreigner with no useful skills the same standing it extends every being. Aboard. The right to earn her keep with witnesses. I have been measured my whole life, at my presentation, at my betrothal, at every feast of 2 courts. Pelham Reach is the first place that ever measured something I did rather than something I am. The Guild may decide whether that violates the comedy owed between species. It does violate the comedy practice between crowns. I can offer the Guild no relief on that point. The crown's comedy deserves the violating." A sound moved along the bulkheads, not laughter, pressure finding a seam. Pell's file voice did not change. Day 31, the near fatality. "The statement holds you were present in deadly hazard through the dock's negligence. I was present. The hazard was a fouled tether on a misflagged line. The flagging failure of a hand the Halmark Combine had hired off this dock 9 days earlier, with 5 others in a single afternoon on the eve of crush season." Oriah turned her head, unhurried, and looked at Dre for exactly 1 full second, a unit of attention the entire room knew how to convert. "The Guild may wish to sequence those events for itself. I testify to what the record shows, that the dock's drills held, that a boy is alive, and that I stood 4 lanes away and called geometry while the riggers of Deck 9 put their bodies into the lane. If the throne wishes to know what was done to its treasure on day 31, the answer is in the book. Nothing was done to me. Something was done in front of me by the finest crew on the circuit, and I will spend the rest of my life, wherever it is spent, measuring conduct against it. The statement further questions, Pell said, dry as ever but slower now, the file finding a grain it liked, whether a dock so casual with the dignity of crowns can be trusted with the cargo of 2 civilizations. Madam Auditor, in 90 days I have watched this dock handle 60-ton loads above the heads of people it loves, on schedules written by people it's never met, 6 hands short without losing 1 gram or 1 life. Cargo is the only dignity it is casual about. Cargo it treats as physics, which is the correct religion. As for crowns, she touched the brass chit at her collar, the smallest gesture, and aimed the next sentence not at the auditors, but courteously and without haste, at the glowing recorder crystal of the Solon's throne. I came off the ring in a gown that cost the labor of 9 artisans for 3 years. A rigger cut me out of it in 4 seconds to keep me off a 60-ton hook, and his only discourtesy was that he kept counting his lane while he did it, because the lane had his people in it, and I did not yet. I have thought about that count every day for a season, Excellencies. It is the most honest precedent system I have ever stood inside. This dock was casual with my dignity in precisely one respect. It assumed I had my own before I had given it any evidence. Charters have been granted on worse collateral. Pell looked at her for a long moment over the rims of nothing, the way auditors look when arithmetic and something older than arithmetic agree. The witness is excused, she said. The Guild thanks the crew lead. The Guild notes for the record that it audits docks, not princesses, and finds itself in the unusual position of having had this clarified by one. The Guild's findings posted on the morning of the 93rd day. Charter affirmed, term renewed, throughput commendation entered, anomalies positive. The Combine's interested party filings were returned annotated in Pell's small dry hand with Guild citations that ended the matter the way bulkhead, doors and weather. Dre's shuttle departed before second shift without a courtesy pass at anyone. The dock did not cheer the posting. Docks don't. Word moved hand to hand down the lanes like a load on rollers. Charter held, term renewed, kid carried it, and the work went on. But all that shift the work had a hum under it. And at mess that night, Bell came out of his kingdom personally, with a tray, and set down in front of Araya, without one word, a slice of honey bread the size of a hatch cover, the galley's coronation. The mess thumped once. She ate it to the last crumb with 200 witnesses and ranked the honor in the long registry of her honors first. Vorn transmitted no congratulations. What came down instead, that evening, on the Throne's channel, in the Throne's perfume, was one line, all theater ends when the curtain does. 4 days. And beneath the words, for the first time, she could read the man plainly. He had spent every blade in his case, the buyout and the shame and the grain and the Guild, and none had cut, and so he had fallen back on the one weapon that had never failed an envoy of the pageant worlds in 200 years, the door itself, the simple, patient fact of the open ring. The Calibrants completed the coil on the 96th day, a day ahead of their own season, because Crystal, Calibrant Seth, informed Tan with the Guild's idea of humor does not respect schedules in either direction. The spin-up, the slow waking of the lattice, the threading of the wefts light back through half a mile of braided alloy, would begin at first bell, on the 97th day, and run 12 hours, and at last bell the ring would open. And the first thing scheduled through it, by treaty precedents that no station master could shuffle, was the bridal passage of the Solon's throne. The dock spent the 96th day pretending, with the professional discipline of people who pretend nothing, that it was any other day. The rotation ran. The complaints department sat its evening session. Tomas brought her a letter for his mother to seal. The custom had spread. She had become, somehow, the dock's scribe for words that needed weight, and stood there while she signed it, working his jaw, and finally said, "It was a good season," in the voice of a man closing a door gently, and left before she could answer, which was a mercy, because she had no answer rated for that load. Joss worked his lane, she worked hers. At shift's end they sat at the rigging bench out of pure habit, with nothing left to splice, and the silence between them, which had been all season, the most furnished room she had ever lived in, stood empty for the first time, because the only thing left in it was the thing neither of them would put a hand on. 11 years of deportment held her voice level when she finally said, "Ask me." He looked up. "You have never once asked me for anything," she said. "Not in 96 days. I have inventoried, Joss. The whole season, you taught me, you trained me, you stood room for me, and you never put one finger on the scale. So I am telling you formally, at this bench, that the scale will bear it. Ask me." And she watched him stand at the door of it, the way he had at the bench on the 80th day. Watched him pick the thing up. She saw the weight of it move through him, saw exactly how much it cost, which was the point, which was everything, and she watched him set it back down. "No," he said. "Why? Because you've spent your whole life inside other people's asking." His voice stayed level as a lane, but his hands on the empty bench had closed. "Your mother's realm asks, the throne asks, the envoy asks with a knife in it. Every room you ever stood in wanted something, and they grew you so the wanting would land on a trained surface. You said it yourself. Day one I taught you splices. Management of wanting. That's the skill. So no, Oriah, I'm not joining the queue. There's a door opening tomorrow with your whole sky on the other side of it and granaries, and your mother's heavier downstrokes, and you're going to stand at that threshold and make the only kind of decision worth your hands." And here, his economy failed him or saved him. He stopped and started again quieter. "Day 31, you counted the boy first. Tomorrow, whatever you count first, that's yours. I'm not going to be one more voice in the lane calling numbers at you. The count is yours." It was never anybody else's to call. The silence came back furnished. "And if I walk through," she said, "then Deck 9's book will say a crew lead served her contract to term," Joss said, "and her line was good every day of it." He stood, shouldered his kit, and at the hatch he turned all the way around, both eyes, longer than any second he had ever paid anyone, and what he said then she carried afterward the way the book carried names. "It was never the gown they wasted, putting you in processions," he said. "It was the rigor." First bell of the 97th day rang spin-up, and the ring began to wake. It woke the way the dock had taught her big things move, slowly, irreversibly, with everyone's eyes on it. By second bell, the dead gray threads of the lattice had a shimmer in their depths like water remembering. By fourth bell, the whole half-mile band hummed in the deck plates, a note below hearing that lived in the boot soles and the back teeth, and the calibrants walked their maintenance ring in slow procession, reading the coil's new harmonic with instruments older than both species' treaties. And the dock worked because the spin-up had been scheduled by people who had never stood on a deck into the middle of the season's last triple convoy, and the tonnage did not care what was waking overhead. The lanes ran full, the gantry swung. 60-ton movers walked their rails under a God's wedding band coming slowly alight, and Tan's standing order for the day was one sentence long, posted at every hatch. "Traffic rules apply to everyone today. Everyone." The Solent's flotilla had its own opinion of human traffic rules. It came down at sixth bell, while the lattice was still threading. The throne's ceremonial escort, a knife-hulled cutter in gray and flame, descending toward berth 14 ahead of its filed window to take up the honor station for the bridal passage, and descending in parade trim on a parade line straight across the active approach corridor where Pelham Reach's outbound convoy was climbing. Oriah was on the operations deck when it happened, summoned by Tan for the day's berthing chess, and so she heard it whole on the open channels. Dock traffic control giving the cutter its holding instruction, twice in clean guild phrasing, and the cutter's flag lieutenant answering, in trade tongue glazed with Salance bore, the 11 words that would be quoted at 2 courts for a generation. "Throne vessels hold station for no one's count. Continue as filed." The cutter crossed the corridor's throat with 400 meters of clearance, which in parade terms was contemptuous abundance, and in freight terms was nothing at all, because freight is not a formation of dancers. Freight is mass, and mass forgives nothing. The climbing convoy's lead freighter, the Marin Tide, 80,000 tons of grain, crewed by 9 families, did the only correct thing, which was an emergency yaw to hold separation, and the yaw rippled back down the climb line ship by ship like a whip crack down a cable, and the last ship in the line, still in the dock's close grip, shed its excess velocity the only place it could. Into the dock's own outbound mass driver train. 41 loaded containers riding the magnetic rail off the spur's end, queued for the climb. The freighter's wake thrust slapped the train's tail section in its cradle, and 3 couplers, rated for everything except a warship's manners, sheared. Oriah watched the board light up red along the spur's whole spine, and the next half-second lasted, as such half-seconds do, a very long time. She saw it whole. That had always been the thing about her. 3 containers loose on the rail, 180 tons, still carrying boost, riding a magnetic guideway that ran the length of the spur, directly beneath the ring. Beneath the half-woken lattice the calibrants had grown for 96 days, past Deck 9, where the day shift was working the convoy. The rail's automatic arrest, the only system that mattered, was offline, because every interlock along the spur had been put into hand-supervised mode for spin-up, in accordance with treaty protocol, to protect the ring from exactly nothing that was actually happening. The voice that came out of her was the one that carried down generations. Tan, breakaway, driver rail, 3 cars, hand-mowed the whole spur. Her finger was already on the board's relay key. Her other hand was flying glove code at the operations deck windows for the benefit of every Sightline below, triple relay, the dock's oldest language, faster than any queue of panicking channels. Traffic, dump the climb line wide. All ships, give them the whole sky. Deck 9, and here her voice did not change, did not spike, came down the open channel like rail itself, because 200 people were about to hear it, and panic is a posture. Deck 9, this is Seneval on operations. Breakaway train inbound on the driver rail, 3 cars, 90 seconds. Clear the rail margin and stand by the manual arrests. Renner holds the count. Renner holds the count. The channel came back, level, and underneath the words she heard Deck 9 begin to move the way a good court moved at. The murder of a king, no screaming, everything in order of precedence, fastest things first. What the recorder crystals carried away from the next 90 seconds, and there were many, half the WEFT would eventually watch this, which mattered, though nobody had time to know it yet, was this. Wex's crane, abandoning its load mid-swing with hook flying, slewing down rail to the third arrest point, because Wex did not wait to be told that a crane's mass was the only adjustable ballast on the spur. Garn and his welding gang at the second arrest, hauling the manual brake shoes onto the rail in their cradles, 400 pounds a shoe, 6 shoes, 40 seconds. Tomas Ruiz, 17 on the margin line, sweeping the rails blind bay with 3 green hands and getting a deaf loader driver bodily, out of the kill zone with 11 seconds of margin. The calibrants, and this no one had asked, no one would have dared ask, stopping their procession above, and in perfect guild unison shifting the half-born lattice's harmonic so the ring's field stopped fighting the rail's magnetics, a thing only they understood and only they could do. The pageant world's holiest engineers putting their cathedral into neutral to give the stevedores 3% more of brake, and the count. Joss Renner's voice on the open channel, steady as a metronome over running boots and shrieking metal, calling the breakaway's position by rail marker, Kurt 9, marker 8. Stand clear the margin, she's still carrying. Marker 7, the whole dock moving on his numbers. Every shoe and crane and sprinting back timed off, one calm voice doing arithmetic out loud, the heartbeat audible at last, the thing his mother had taught him at 13 scaled up to the size of the sky. The first arrest shoe took 30 tons of speed and burst like a struck bell. The second bank, Garns held for 4 seconds and shaved the rest of the boost. And the 3 cars came grinding into the crane-aplasted third arrest at walking pace. Walking pace, the dance's whole art, never needing it to stop, and stopped 11 meters short of the rail's end, under the ring, in a long shriek of spent iron, and the sound that went up off Deck 9 was not a cheer. It was one beat, 200 hands on whatever stood nearest, like a heart. Meeker's 0. Joss said on the open channel, into it. All counted. Everyone. It was at this point that First Envoy Hadri's Vorn, watching from the flagship with the bridle passage 2 hours away, and his career sliding greasily out from under his own cutter's wake, made the decision that unmade him. He attempted to manage the record. The throne's channel went out wideband, perfumed urgent. Deep concern of the Solon's throne at the docks evident unreadiness. Gratitude of 2 crowns that no royal property had been endangered. Expectation that, in light of this displayed hazard, her radiance would now be transferred immediately to the flagship's protection, ahead of the passage. And down to berth 14, with magnificent tone deafness, came a Solon's honor guard, 11 gilded soldiers with a sedan platform, dispatched across a deck still hauling spent brake shoes off the rail to collect her. They had to cross Deck 9 to reach the operations stair. The deck did not block them. The deck did something Araya would never have thought to script and could not have because it was not grammar from her world. The deck stopped working. Hand by hand, crane by crane, lane by lane, in the deliberate sequence of a controlled shutdown. Loads racked, hooks settled, all safe, all proper. The day shift of Deck 9 secured its stations, turned and stood, silent, watching. 200 beings in scorched coveralls standing in attendance along the route of the sedan platform, in ranks straighter than anything on a parade ground, because these were people who stacked things for a living. And the gilded guard slowed and stopped, in the middle of a working dock gone perfectly still, with its 11 ceremonial sidearms and its cushioned platform, surrounded by the only honor formation the dock knew how to form. Presence, witness, total. Their captain, young Araya, saw from the stair, under the gilt, only a young officer doing the worst errand of his life, looked at the ranks, looked at the sedan platform, looked up at her on the operations stair in her scorched coveralls with the brass at her collar. And he made the precedence decision of his career. He turned his 11, formed them into a Solon's honor file, and saluted her. Throne salute, full depth held, rendered by the throne's own guard on a human freight deck to a princess in coveralls in front of every recorder crystal on the spur. The throne's escort stands ready when her radiance pleases, he said, and not one syllable about transfer or protection or now. Thank you, Captain, Araya said. Her radiance is on shift. The ring opened at last bell, on schedule, because the calibrants did not respect schedules in either direction. The lattice came alive in one soundless breath, half a mile of woven light, water deciding to be light after all, the most beautiful thing two civilizations had ever built together, and the first thing through it was not the bridal passage. It was a priority diplomatic transmission, flagged with the seals of two crowns at once. The veiled sovereign of Iridal and the Solon's throne. Joint channel, eyes of all parties. 97 days of 19-day round trips had ended, and the courts of her world were suddenly, after a season at the far end of the longest lever in her life, one step away. Tan brought her the summons herself. It was not phrased as a request, the presence of her Radiance Araya Seneval before the joint channel within the hour, for resolution of the matter of the passage. They'll want it tidy, Tan said. Bride through the ring, curtain down, season expunged. You ready for that room? Araya looked down from the operations deck at the dock, at Deck 9 back in motion under the living ring, at Garn's gang stacking the burst brake shoes for the foundry, at the long scorch on the rail that would be there for years and would be pointed at, she already knew, by hands telling green hands the story of the day the Count held, and she felt the strange calm of a person who has finally, after a lifetime of other people's geometry, seen the whole board from her own square. Station master, she said, I have been ready for that room since day 31. Kindly have Priya bring the book. The joint channel convened in the dock's contract hall, her choice. The summons had assumed the flagship, and she had answered, with perfect courtesy, that the contract hall of Pelham Reach was the venue of record for matters of contract, and no one on either side of the lattice had been able to find the flaw in it. The ring's light filled the hall's long viewport. On the channel's twin projection stood the two powers of her sky, her mother, the veiled sovereign of Iridal, veiled in the iron gray of state, attended by the shadows of her council, and Prince Idmar of the Solon's throne, whom Araya now saw in any real sense for the first time. Her betrothed was younger than his portraits, which had been painted to add weight, and stiller than his letters, which had been drafted to add warmth. He stood in the candle glow of the hall of 10,000 candles where she should have arrived 97 days ago, and he looked at her, coveralls, brass, the orange band, the Book of Pelham Reach on its stand at her side, with an expression she spent a moment translating because it was the last thing she had expected to find in the Solon's throne's air. Envy. Quiet, hopeless, well-mannered envy. First Envoy Vorn stood at the edge of Idmar's projection and began, because managing the record was the only instinct he had left. Ready answers, Majesties, the throne rejoices that this season of mischance concludes. The passage stands ready. With the joint channel's leave, the contracts of betrothal. The contracts of betrothal, Araya said, are the agenda. The first envoy may stand at ease. Her mother's veil tilted 1 degree. Inside the veil, that was a klaxon, Majesties. She had drafted it through the night at the rigging bench on grease pencil pages in the only two grammars she trusted, court and dock, and she delivered it now standing, without notes, in the petitioner's iron that had been forged in one world and carbon-hardened in the other. 97 days ago, a marriage was contracted to solve a freight problem. Iridal grain crosses Solon space because it has no other road. The bride was the toll. I have spent the season at the foot of the Weft learning freight, and I am here to report to both crowns. The problem has a better solution than me. She laid it out the way Okafor posted a morning roster. No flourish, all load path, the Pelham Compact. A direct charter between the Iridal Court and the Human Carriers Guild, primary haulage of Iridal's bulk tonnage by human convoy through Pelham Reach, at rates she had negotiated in principle with the Guild's auditors during 4 days of charter hearings, on routes that crossed no Solant's border at any point. The renewed ring's traffic precedents, pledged in writing by the Calibrant Guild, whose elders did not sign things and had signed this because the dock had given their cathedral back its breath and the Guild paid debts in the only currency it minted. The season's throughput record, Guild certified as proof of capacity, the commendation, the book itself in evidence. Iridal grain would move at 2/3 the current landed cost in human hulls forever, and no daughter of the Veil would ever again be a unit of account in it. The throne loses a bride, she said, turning to Idmar's projection, and gains release from a treaty that obliged it to garrison lanes it never wanted to police, against a partner it would otherwise not have chosen. I have read our contract closely, Radiance. It was read to me at age 9, and I confess it improved on acquaintance, and its dissolution clause requires only mutual cause shown before witnesses of both crowns. I show mine. The alliance's purpose is achieved by other means. Show yours, and we are both free, and our houses are friends, which the marriage would never have made them. Silence on two worlds at once. Vorn drew breath, and Idmar lifted one hand, and the breath died unspent. I watched the recordings, Idmar said. His voice off the candlelit projection was unexpectedly plain, almost shy of its own throne room. Of your docks afternoon. They reached us with the first lattice light. Your envoy's office moved swiftly to provide context. A pause, exquisitely placed. The boy had his own iron somewhere under the candles. I watched a human crew stop a 180-ton breakaway with handbrakes because my escort would not hold for account. And I watched my own guard render the throne salute to you, unordered, and I find I have been trying since to remember one thing I have ever done that would make 11 soldiers do that for me. He looked at her, through the lattice, across the last step of the road she had never finished, and gave her, with the smallest bow of his head, the only gift the pageant worlds had left to give. 'Cause shone radiance. The throne releases with honor what it never held. I'd have liked, and for one unguarded half-second the portrait's weight fell entirely away, I'd have liked to learn what you learned. My ring opens onto a hall of candles. Then put a door in it, Radiance, Araya said gently. I am told all the best worlds are at the foot of one. Her mother spoke last, as the veil always spoke last. The iron-gray veil faced its daughter for a long moment across the lattice light, and the council shadows behind her held very still. And when the veiled sovereign's voice came, it came formal and slow, each word weighed out like grain. The court of Iridel ratifies the compact of Pelham, she said, and dissolves, with friendship affirmed, the contract of Solence. And as the compact requires of us a standing authority at the foot of the ring, an office of the blood, resident, empowered to bind the court in matters of trade, the veil tilted again, 1 degree, and beneath the iron formula her mother's true voice moved for just 3 words, heavier on the downstrokes than any letter, see it whole. The court appoints its third daughter warden of the Iridal trade at Pelham Reach, for a term of her own naming. The channel thanks the witnesses. The matter concludes. The projections faded. The ring's light stood in the viewport, and First Envoy Hadri's Vorn's image lingered a half-second longer than the others. Long enough for Araya to watch the career arithmetic finish. Behind his eyes, the flagship already drafting the recall that would dress his ruin in honors, and to her absolute astonishment he bowed to her before the channel cut. Not 11 degrees, the full depth. Property recovery protocol abandoned at last, one professional saluting another across a board she had swept. You were grown to be a gift, he said. I will tell the throne it was outbid. There remained the passage itself. Treaty precedence was treaty precedence. The slot stood booked at first bell next day, bridal or no, and the veil's grammar required that what had been scheduled in state be concluded in state, walked to formally, even if only to be formally declined. Her mother's office, with what Araya was certain was the first joke the veil had committed in a century, reflagged the manifest entry overnight. Not bridal passage, but warden, installation of passage optional. The doc came to see her walk it. They had earned that, she had insisted, and Tan had posted it as a stand easy, and so the ring and concourse at first bell held 2,000 beings in coveralls along the rails. The day shift and the night shift, and Bell's whole kingdom with flowers still on its aprons, while the lattice breathed its woven light, and the calibrants stood their procession ring in honor order. She walked the concourse in her working clothes, with the gown, mended now. Priya's needlewomen had taken it as a personal affront for 3 months, carried folded behind her by Tomas Ruiz. Because a warden of the trade required formal dress on the books, and because some loads were lighter when a friend carried them. At the threshold she stopped. Protocol gave her this, 1 minute, alone, at the lattice's edge before declared witnesses to set foot or not. The light moved like water deciding. Through it, 1 step long, lay the veil, the wing with her name, the song with the wing's name. Her sister's true letters made suddenly an afternoon's walk near. Her mother's iron and her mother's 3 words. The whole first world that had grown her better than it knew. It would always be there now, she understood. That was what the compact had bought, truly, not grain rates. A ring that opened both ways for the rest of her life. And from the concourse behind her, in the held breath hush of 2,000 people, she heard the only sound on the spur still moving. Joss Renner's voice, low professional, somewhere just behind the witness line, counting down the protocol minute for the deck log, because the doc logged everything that swung, even hearts. 41, he said quietly in the hush. 42. And then, for the first time in 11 years, before 2,000 witnesses, with the whole WEF's light on the board, nothing. The count stopped. She turned around. He was standing at the line with the tally counter in his fist and his thumb still on the lever, looking at her through the lattice light, and the man who had cut her out of the sky without missing a number, who had run a breakaway on plain arithmetic, who had stood at the door of asking with his whole life in his hands and racked it because the count was hers, had lost it. 1 number, dropped on the deck in front of everyone, the only tell he had ever given, and he knew it, and he stood inside it with his chin level and let her see. It was the most articulate thing she had ever heard a being not say. Tally Mistress, Araya said into the hush. In the voice that carried down generations, let the record show the warden declined the passage. Her work is here. The concourse did not cheer either. It did the other thing, the dock thing, the one beat of 200, of 2,000, hands on rails and shoulders and hatch frames, a single heartbeat the size of a station. And then because tonnage waits for no installation, the bells rang shift and Pelham Reach went back to work around her, which was, as inaugurations go, the truest one ever staged. He met her at the edge of the line, where a yellow boundary had once been the whole of her world. Up close, his thumb came off the tally lever. The rumor at the corner of his mouth had finally, after 98 days, made the news. You lost count, she said. 42, Joss said. I never lose count. I set a load down. He looked at her, both eyes, all seconds, the whole treasury, and asked her at last the only thing he had ever asked her, now that it could not command her, now that it weighed nothing, now that she stood on her own square with her own brass at her collar and a ring at her back that opened both ways. Shift starts at 6, Warden. Walk in with me? On one condition, she said, and reached up, and took the tally counter out of his hand the way he had once taken her elbow, firmly, briefly, 60 tons of meaning in 4 ounces of brass, and clipped it to her own harness beside the foreman's chit. You taught me a rule, day 1 of vacuum drill. The anchor points are rated for 1. 2 lines on 1 anchor, you said, is for 1 circumstance only. Emergency, he said, or trespassed arguing, same clip either way. She took her line and snapped it onto his anchor point, in front of God, the calibrants, the book, and the day shift of Deck 9 so entered, she said. 3 seasons later, when the grain convoys of the Pelham Compact had grown so regular that the granary worlds called the route the Warden's Road, when a second complaints department sign, in much better lettering, hung in the new arrivals hall beside the rules of work for berth, printed in 4 court scripts, when Marin had visited twice, stepping off the lattice the first time in plain traveling clothes, looking around the roaring concourse and announcing, so this is where they manufacture my sister, and when a certain candlelit throne hall, it was reliably reported, had ordered the architectural survey for a freight dock of its own. The Book of Pelham Reach recorded, in Priya Nunn's tall iron hand, between a tonnage line and a weather note, the marriage of O. Seneval, warden, to J. Renner, rigger, on the deck of berth 14 witnesses, all hands. The line below it, added in a different hand, added in fact by the bride, who had learned from the dock that the only decorations worth keeping are the ones you write yourself, lift by lift, day by day, was short, the way the load-bearing things always were. He saw her when she fell, it said. She stayed when the door opened. Count held.